It was late July, and my girlfriend, Emma, and I had planned a camping trip with her family in the mountains of southern Colorado, near a small town called Silver Creek. The area was known for its dense forests, sharp cliffs, and winding mountain roads. 12 years earlier, back when I was in college, I'd had an experience in Apache territory in Arizona that I still couldn't fully explain. It had left me with this strange memory, almost like an echo of something dark I couldn't shake. A friend of mine back then, a full-blooded Apache, had said little about it but seemed to understand. He'd only warned me to trust my instincts if I ever felt that way again. As we settled into the campsite, I noticed how peaceful it was. Emma's family was cheerful, setting up tents, cooking over the fire, and laughing as the sun set behind the mountains. Emma had always struggled with her appetite, and she used marijuana to help her eat. Since she couldn't do that around her family, we planned to sneak away later to find a quiet spot. After dinner, we climbed into my truck and headed down the mountain road. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine filled the cab. The road was paved but narrow, with a steep drop on one side and thick woods on the other. Eventually, we found a small overlook with a pull-off area. The parking lot was empty, surrounded by scattered trees and brush on one side, with a clearer view down the mountain on the other. Below, I could see the lights of a few distant ranches and the faint glow of the town far away. It felt remote, but not dangerously so. Emma loaded her pipe while I leaned back in my seat, trying to relax. But as the minutes ticked by, a strange tension started creeping in. At first, it was just a subtle awareness, like the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. Then it turned into something heavier, like static electricity crawling over my skin. I brushed it off as paranoia, just nerves combined with the eerie quiet of the mountains at night. Then I heard it, a faint rustling in the brush to our left, where the woods were thicker. It wasn't much at first, just a soft crunching, like an animal moving through tall grass. I figured it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but as the sound grew louder, I noticed a rhythm to it, almost like footsteps, and they were too deliberate for an animal, too steady. I glanced at Emma, but she seemed relaxed, lost in her thoughts as she took another hit. I didn't want to alarm her, so I kept my eyes on the dark trees, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But the sound didn't stop. It grew closer, and the cadence was unmistakably human. I squinted into the darkness and froze. There, just beyond the edge of the parking lot, a shadow moved. It was tall and upright, slowly making its way up the hill toward us. My heart started racing, and memories of that night years ago in Arizona came flooding back. My hand hovered near the keys in the ignition as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stopped at the edge of the lot, partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. That's when Emma spoke up, her voice breaking the silence. She said she thought she heard footsteps on the pavement. My stomach dropped. Before I could say anything, I heard it, two clear, deliberate footsteps on the asphalt, coming from the other side of the lot. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized what was happening. There were two sets of footsteps, one in the brush and one on the pavement, both moving toward us. My instincts kicked in. I turned the key, the engine roared to life, and I slammed the truck into reverse. The tires skidded on the gravel as I backed out of the lot and onto the road. I didn't look back as I sped down the mountain, the headlights cutting through the darkness. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly they hurt, and Emma sat in stunned silence beside me. The drive back to the campsite felt like it took forever. Every shadow on the side of the road made me flinch. Every rustle in the trees sent my heart racing. When we finally pulled into the campsite, Emma's family was sitting around the fire, laughing and roasting marshmallows like nothing had happened. I parked the truck and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing. We spent the next 2 nights in that tent, but I barely slept. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I thought of those footsteps, of that shadowy figure moving toward us. I kept replaying the moment in my mind, trying to make sense of it. If it had been animals, they wouldn't have moved like that. Black bears don't walk on two legs for that long, and there are no other predators in those mountains that could explain what we saw. If it had been humans, their behavior was even more unsettling. Two people approaching a parked truck in the middle of nowhere at night couldn't have had good intentions. But the thought that haunted me the most was the one I couldn't explain away. What if it wasn't human? That memory from years ago, that lingering sense of something watching me, came back stronger than ever. I love the mountains, but that trip left me with a deep respect for the wilderness, and a reminder that sometimes you're not alone out there. That day at Bear Creek, I was 15. My family and I were on a camping trip at a popular spot in northern Oregon. It was the summer of 2003, and the creek was famous for its natural rock slides. Smooth, worn-down stones guided the water like a perfect slide at a water park. My parents had heard about it from some friends, and the promise of nature's playground made it a must-see for our trip. The day started off perfectly. The sun beamed down through tall pine trees. The air was warm but not oppressive, and the cool creek water was just the relief we needed. The sound of rushing water echoed off the rocks, blending with the occasional bird calls and the rustling of leaves in the light breeze. The slides were crowded with families and kids like us, all laughing and splashing as they slid down the water-slicked stones. My little brother, Daniel, who was 10, was having the time of his life. He kept daring me to see who could go down the fastest. My mom and dad had settled on a flat boulder upstream with some other adults, talking and sharing snacks, while I mostly stayed in the water, taking every chance to slide down the rocks. The creek wasn't deep, maybe waist-high in most places, but the current was stronger than it looked. First, it was all fun. I would slide down, land in the pool below, and climb back up to do it again. The thrill of flying down the slick rock with water spraying all around was addictive. I was completely soaked within minutes, but the heat from the sun quickly made it bearable. After a few hours, the crowd started to thin out. Some families packed up their things, leaving the area quieter. My parents were still chatting, my brother was trying to build a dam with some other kids, and I decided to stay in the water a little longer. The coolness felt good after all the climbing and sliding. I floated near the base of the slide, letting the gentle current push me around. The pool at the bottom of the slide was calm enough, but further downstream, the water sped up noticeably. I hadn't paid much attention to where the creek led, assuming it was just more rocks and shallow pools like the rest of the area. But as I drifted closer to the edge of the pool, I felt the pull of the current grow stronger. I kicked my feet to push myself back toward the slide, but the smooth rocks under the water offered no grip. The current was faster than I expected, tugging me downstream inch by inch. I told myself I was fine. I just needed to swim harder. But as I paddled, my arms started to ache, and panic crept in when I realized I wasn't making any progress. The water grew louder as the creek narrowed. I glanced downstream and saw something that made my stomach drop. The water rushed over a steep drop, no, not just steep, a full-blown waterfall. The sight of the cascading water, white and foaming as it plummeted down, froze me for a second. My mind raced. I had no idea how far the drop was, but it looked high, too high. The current was dragging me faster now, and I scrambled to find something to hold on to. My hands scraped against the rocks, but they were too smooth, too slippery. My feet couldn't find purchase either. I shouted, but the sound of rushing water drowned out my voice. I doubted anyone would hear me anyway. My family was too far upstream. As I neared the edge, I spotted a tree branch hanging low over the water. It wasn't thick, but it looked sturdy enough. My instincts kicked in. I lunged for it, stretching my arms as far as they could go. My fingertips brushed the branch, then caught hold. The current pulled at my body with brutal force, making my arms scream in pain as I clung to the branch. For a moment, I was sure it would snap. The wood creaked and shifted under my weight, but it held. I used every ounce of strength I had left to pull myself out of the water, my legs thrashing against the current. Slowly, agonizingly, I inched my way onto the rocks. My chest heaved as I collapsed on solid ground, my limbs trembling from exertion. I sat there for a moment, staring at the waterfall just a few feet away. The water thundered down into a misty abyss, and I couldn't see the bottom. If I had gone over, I wouldn't have survived. My heart pounded as the realization sank in. When I finally managed to stand, my legs wobbled beneath me. I stumbled my way back upstream, sticking close to the rocky bank this time. My family was still where I'd left them, completely unaware of what had just happened. My brother waved at me, and my parents smiled as if nothing was wrong. I didn't say a word about it. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to scare them or ruin the day. Or maybe I just didn't want to relive the moment. But for the rest of the trip, I couldn't shake the image of that waterfall. I kept picturing myself going over the edge, disappearing into the mist below. Even now, years later, I can still feel the pull of that current, the raw panic in my chest, and the rough bark of that branch in my hands. It was the closest I've ever come to dying, and no one even noticed. In the summer of 2013, my friend Katie and I decided to go camping in a remote part of northern Idaho. We were both in our early 20s, adventurous, and looking to escape the chaos of daily life. We'd spent the past few weeks planning this trip, poring over maps and researching secluded spots far from crowded campgrounds. Eventually, we settled on a small, unnamed lake deep in the forest. It wasn't listed on any major trail maps, but we'd found a few references to it online. The pictures looked pristine, the kind of place where you could hear your thoughts. The drive took most of the day. The farther we went, the fewer cars we passed. By late afternoon, we were bumping along a narrow dirt road, barely wide enough for my old Subaru. The forest was dense, the trees pressing in on either side. It felt like we were entering a different world. We arrived at the lake just before sunset. The air was crisp and cool, the water still and dark, reflecting the orange-pink sky. There was no one else there. Not a single car, camper, or sign of another person. It was exactly what we'd wanted. We quickly set up our tent on a flat patch of ground a few feet from the water. The lake was smaller than I'd expected, more like a large pond surrounded by towering pines. The silence was almost unnerving. There were no birds, no frogs, just the faint rustle of wind through the trees. After setting up camp, we started a small fire and cooked dinner. The food tasted better out there, with the smoky scent of the fire and the crisp night air. We talked and laughed, enjoying the solitude. As the sky darkened, the stars came out in full force, more than I'd ever seen before. It felt like the universe was right there above us. We stayed up late, sitting by the fire, until the chill finally drove us into the tent. We zipped ourselves inside, the nylon walls feeling thin and fragile against the vastness of the wilderness. I remember lying there, listening to the faint sounds of the forest, feeling both at peace and on edge. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to a strange sound. It wasn't loud, more like a soft thud, but it was enough to jolt me awake. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I stayed still, straining to hear. Then it happened again, louder this time. Something hit the tent, causing the fabric to bow inward. It wasn't a small nudge. It was forceful, deliberate. My heart started racing. Katie was awake now too. I could feel her shifting beside me. Neither of us spoke, but I could sense her fear. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? But there was no growling, no sniffing, none of the sounds you'd expect. Before I could think of what to do, it happened again. This time, the tent caved in completely, the poles snapping under the weight. We were flattened beneath the fabric, trapped in a cocoon of nylon. My face was pressed into the floor, the scent of dirt and pine needles filling my nose. I could hear faint footsteps outside, but they were strange, soft, almost hesitant. They didn't match the force that had crushed the tent. Whatever was out there wasn't running around or making a racket. It was moving carefully, deliberately. I wanted to move, to push the tent off, to see what was happening, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. Every instinct screamed to stay still, to stay quiet. Beside me, Katie was trembling. I could feel her breaths coming in short, panicked bursts. Minutes felt like hours. The weight pressing down on the tent would shift slightly, then go still. It wasn't constant, like something was testing it, almost curious. My mind raced through every possible explanation. A moose? A human? But nothing fit. At one point, the pressure lifted entirely, and I thought maybe it was over. But then it came back, heavier than before. Pushed down so hard that I could barely breathe. My chest compressed against the ground. Eventually, the weight lifted again, and the footsteps grew fainter. It moved away, back toward the forest. I didn't dare move for what felt like an eternity. When I finally did, I peeled the fabric away from my face, gasping for air. Katie and I scrambled out of the tent, shaking and disoriented. The fire had gone out, leaving us in near total darkness. The tent was ruined, the poles bent and broken, the fabric torn in places. I looked around, but there was no sign of whatever had been there. We didn't say a word as we gathered our things. It was a frantic, clumsy process, shoving everything into the trunk of the car. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. We drove out of there as fast as the road would allow, the tires kicking up dust and gravel. It wasn't until we were miles away, back on a paved road, that I felt like I could breathe again. Even now, years later, I can't explain what happened. I've told myself it was probably an animal, something big and curious, but it doesn't add up. There were no claw marks, no tracks, no sounds you'd expect from a bear or a moose. It felt deliberate. I've never been back to that lake, and I don't plan to. Whatever was out there that night, I don't want to meet it again. It was late September 2018 when my gym buddy, Kevin, and I decided to go camping. We had been working out together for a couple of years, and our friendship extended outside the gym walls. Kevin was a cop, tough as nails, and he had a knack for convincing me to do things I wouldn't usually consider. This camping trip was one of those things. Kevin had this idea of going deep into the woods to disconnect and test ourselves. It wasn't just a simple camping trip. He wanted to rough it out with minimal gear, just us, nature, and a tent. He assured me he knew the area, an isolated patch of forest in Pennsylvania where he'd camped a few times before. The spot was miles away from any trails, and Kevin promised it would be peaceful. We packed light: a tent, sleeping bags, a portable stove, some canned food, and water filters. Kevin also brought his service pistol, saying it was just for safety. I thought it was overkill, but I didn't argue. He was a cop after all. The drive to the forest took us nearly 3 hours. The road narrowed as we got closer, the pavement eventually giving way to gravel. Finally, Kevin parked his truck at a small, unmarked clearing. From there, we had to hike another 2 hours to reach his perfect spot. The hike was brutal. The air was crisp, and the leaves were just beginning to turn shades of red and gold. First, I enjoyed the scenery, but as we ventured deeper, the trees grew denser, and the silence became unsettling. Kevin led the way, confident and calm, while I struggled to keep up. We finally arrived at a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The area felt untouched, like no one had been there in years. Kevin set up the tent while I gathered firewood. By the time the sun began to set, we had a decent campfire going. We ate in silence, listening to the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional hoot of an owl. The isolation was both peaceful and unnerving. Kevin seemed completely at ease, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia. It was my first time camping this far off the grid. That first night, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like branches snapping in the distance. I lay still, listening intently. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Footsteps. I nudged Kevin, but he was already awake. He put a finger to his lips, signaling me to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever, or whatever, was out there could hear it. Kevin slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to peek outside. He didn't say a word, but his body tensed. After a few minutes, he zipped it back up and whispered, "Probably an animal. Go back to sleep." I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, Kevin acted like nothing had happened. I followed his lead, trying to shake off the unease from the night before. We spent the day exploring the area, hiking to a nearby stream to refill our water bottles. As we were walking back to camp, Kevin stopped abruptly. He pointed to the ground where we saw a trail of footprints, barefoot human footprints. They weren't ours and they didn't look old. Kevin's demeanor changed. He scanned the area, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered pistol. "Let's head back," he said. When we got to camp, nothing seemed out of place. Still, Kevin insisted we keep the fire going all night, even during daylight. He didn't say it, but I could tell he was just as unsettled as I was. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled the tent. Kevin grabbed his pistol and whispered for me to stay inside. He unzipped the tent and stepped out, leaving me alone. I could hear him walking around, the crunch of leaves under his boots. Then silence. For what felt like an eternity, there was nothing but the sound of my own breathing. Finally, Kevin came back. He didn't say much, just that he didn't see anything. But his face was pale, and his hands were trembling. We decided to pack up and leave. Kevin didn't argue when I suggested it, which wasn't like him. As we were dismantling the tent, I noticed something etched into one of the nearby trees. A crude drawing of a human figure. I showed it to Kevin, and he muttered something under his breath. He didn't say what he thought it was, but his urgency to leave grew. The hike back to the truck felt longer than it should have. Every sound, every movement in the trees made me jump. Kevin stayed ahead, his pistol drawn, scanning the area constantly. When we finally reached the truck, I felt a wave of relief until I saw the windshield. It was cracked, as if someone had struck it with a rock or a bat. Kevin cursed under his breath and checked the rest of the truck. Nothing else seemed damaged, but the sight of that shattered glass sent chills down my spine. The drive home was tense. Neither of us spoke much. Kevin kept checking the rearview mirror as if he expected someone to be following us. When we got back to town, we parted ways without saying much. Kevin told me he'd report the incident to his department, but I never heard any updates. A few weeks later, I looked up the area where we had camped. I found a few news articles about disappearances in the region, hikers and campers who had vanished without a trace. One article mentioned strange symbols carved into trees near their last known locations. I haven't been camping since. I've worked the night shift for years, but this one was different. It was 2015, and I was 29. The job had me stationed as a site monitor for a construction project deep in the Appalachian woods. The company decided it was cheaper to have someone on site 24/7 than to risk theft or vandalism. The project was stalled due to some legal issues, so for months, all I did was sit in a camper and keep an eye on things. It wasn't a bad gig, quiet with plenty of time to myself. That night, the rain started just after sunset. Heavy drops pounded the roof of the camper, creating a droning rhythm that should have been comforting. But there was something about the way the wind howled through the trees and the rain blurred the outlines of the world beyond the small windows. It felt isolating, like I was the last person left alive. I had parked the camper on a gravel patch near the construction site. The woods surrounded me on 3 sides, and beyond the tree line was nothing but miles of dense forest. The site itself was a wide clearing, muddy from the rain, with half-finished structures, stacks of lumber, and heavy machinery scattered around like forgotten toys. My job was simple: check the perimeter every few hours and report any issues. Easy, right? By 9 p.m., the storm had picked up. The wind was so strong it rocked the camper. The lights flickered occasionally, but the generator held up. I sat in the tiny kitchenette, eating cold leftovers, and listening to the static-filled radio. The nearest town was over an hour away, and my cell phone had no signal out here. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. At around 10 p.m., I decided to do my first round of checks. I grabbed my flashlight and rain jacket, then stepped out into the storm. The cold rain hit me like a slap, soaking through my clothes in seconds. The beam of the flashlight barely cut through the downpour, making everything look warped and surreal. I walked the perimeter, my boots sinking into the mud with every step. Everything seemed normal. No signs of trespassers, no wildlife, just the relentless rain and wind. As I headed back to the camper, I noticed something odd. One of the heavy tarps covering the lumber piles had come loose, flapping violently in the wind. I hurried over to secure it, but as I got closer, I saw footprints in the mud. They were fresh, heading away from the tarp and into the woods. My stomach tightened. The prints were human, too large to be anything else, and they hadn't been there earlier. I shined my flashlight toward the tree line, but it was like trying to peer through a thick curtain of rain. I told myself it was probably just someone from the site who'd been here earlier and forgotten to mention it. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I was supposed to be the only one here tonight. Back in the camper, I locked the door and double-checked the windows. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there. I tried to focus on the radio, but every creak of the camper, every gust of wind, made me jump. I kept glancing at the door, half expecting it to burst open. At midnight, I forced myself to do another round. Staying inside felt safer, but I couldn't ignore my duties. I grabbed my flashlight again and stepped outside. The rain had let up slightly, but the air was colder now, and the woods seemed darker, more menacing. As I walked the perimeter, I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. I kept the flashlight low, scanning the ground for any new tracks, but the mud had turned into a soupy mess, making it impossible to tell. Halfway through my check, I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was deliberate, like someone knocking on wood. I froze, straining to pinpoint the direction, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Then it stopped, leaving only the hiss of rain and the rustle of leaves. I waited, my heart pounding, but the noise didn't come back. I hurried back to the camper, my nerves frayed. I locked the door again and sat at the tiny table, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't shake the unease. I felt exposed, like I was being watched. By 2 a.m., the storm had eased into a steady drizzle. I decided to do one final check before hunkering down for the night. The rain had washed away most of the mud, but as I approached the tarp-covered lumber pile, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints were back, but this time there were more of them, dozens crisscrossing around the site, leading in and out of the woods. I scanned the area with my flashlight, my breath fogging in the cold air. Something moved at the edge of the tree line, a shadow quick and low to the ground. I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. I backed away, my pulse hammering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but the camper was my only shelter, and the truck was parked too far away. Inside the camper, I barricaded the door with a chair and sat by the window, clutching a kitchen knife. The rain had stopped, leaving an eerie silence. Hours passed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing faint noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Every sound was a reminder that I wasn't alone. As dawn approached, the sky lightened just enough to see outside. The clearing looked empty, but the footprints were still there, more defined in the soft light. They led away from the camper, back into the woods. I debated packing up and leaving, but my shift ended at 8 a.m., and I didn't want to explain to my boss why I'd abandoned my post. At 7 a.m., I stepped outside, clutching the flashlight even though I didn't need it anymore. I followed the footprints to the edge of the woods, stopping just short of the tree line. The forest felt alive, every shadow and movement a potential threat. I didn't dare go any further. When my replacement arrived, I didn't say anything about the footprints or the noises. I didn't want to seem paranoid or incompetent. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something I couldn't explain. Whatever or whoever was out there, they'd been watching me all night, and they knew I was alone. It was the summer of 2003, and I had just turned 17. My grandfather, a man who had spent his entire life working as a carpenter, decided it was time to pass on some of his outdoor knowledge. He believed it was essential for every man to know how to survive in the wilderness. So, when he suggested a camping trip in the remote woods of northern Minnesota, I didn't hesitate to agree. I always admired my grandfather's strength and wisdom. At 65, he still carried himself like a man in his prime, with calloused hands and a steady voice that made you believe he could handle anything. I figured spending a week out in the wild with him would be fun, even if it was a bit old-fashioned. We packed light, just the essentials: a tent, sleeping bags, a basic first aid kit, a small propane stove, canned food, and a couple of knives. My grandfather insisted on bringing a rifle, just in case, though I didn't think we'd need it. We planned to stay near a large, secluded lake about 20 miles from the nearest paved road. It wasn't a popular spot, which suited us fine. The goal was to escape from the noise of the world, enjoy nature, and test our skills. We arrived at the trailhead on a sunny afternoon. The hike to the campsite was about 5 miles through thick forest. The air was humid, and the mosquitoes were relentless, but the promise of the serene lake kept us moving. The trail was barely a trail at all, more like a faint suggestion of a path that wound through towering pines and dense underbrush. I followed closely behind my grandfather, watching the way he moved with confidence, as if the forest was his second home. When we finally reached the lake, it was breathtaking. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the trees and sky perfectly. There wasn't another soul in sight. We found a flat spot near the shore to set up camp. As we worked, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. By the time we had everything ready, the only light came from our small campfire and the stars overhead. The first night was uneventful. We cooked some canned stew over the fire, talked about random things, and then went to bed early. The silence out there was almost overwhelming. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or distant call of a loon. It took me a while to fall asleep, but when I did, I slept deeply. The second day was more challenging. We spent the morning fishing, but the lake didn't yield much. By noon, the clouds had rolled in, and the air felt heavy. My grandfather suggested we gather extra firewood in case it rained. We spent hours collecting fallen branches and cutting them into manageable pieces. As we worked, I started to notice just how isolated we were. The forest seemed denser than it had the day before, the trees pressing in on us. That night, the rain came. It started as a light drizzle but quickly turned into a downpour. The sound of the rain hitting the tent was deafening, and I found myself feeling uneasy for no clear reason. My grandfather seemed unfazed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. The following morning, the rain had stopped, but the forest was soaked. The trail we had hiked in on was now a muddy mess, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth. We decided to spend the day around camp, drying out our gear and trying to catch some fish. That's when I noticed something strange. About 50 yards from our campsite, near the edge of the forest, there were tracks in the mud. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. At first, I thought they might be ours from the day before, but the more I looked, the more I realized they couldn't be. The prints were too fresh, and they didn't follow the trail we had used. They came from deeper in the woods and stopped abruptly near the water. I showed them to my grandfather, who studied them silently for a moment before shrugging it off. "Probably just a hunter passing through," he said, but I couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. Who else would be out here in the middle of nowhere during a storm? And why had they come so close to our camp? The rest of the day passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That night, as we sat by the fire, I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the darkness for any signs of movement. My grandfather must have noticed because he handed me the rifle and told me to keep it nearby. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The tent was pitch black, and the forest outside was eerily silent. I lay there, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps, coming from the direction of the lake. I reached over and shook my grandfather awake. He listened for a moment and then grabbed the rifle. Without a word, he unzipped the tent and stepped outside. I followed him, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim, orange glow over the campsite. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like something was watching us. My grandfather scanned the area with the rifle, but there was nothing there. After a while, we went back to the tent, but neither of us slept much. The next morning, we decided to pack up and head back early. The forest didn't feel the same anymore. It was as if the trees were closing in on us, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. As we hiked back to the trailhead, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following us. When we finally reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. As we loaded our gear into the trunk, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Stuck to the back of the car was a single muddy handprint. It was the summer of 2013. I was 28 at the time and desperate for a break from my monotonous office job in Chicago. My plan was simple: pack up my car, drive to a remote part of northern Minnesota, and spend a week camping solo. I'd been camping many times before, but always with friends or family. This would be my first time going alone, and I was looking forward to the peace and solitude. I'd done my research. I found a spot near a quiet lake, miles away from the nearest small town. The area wasn't part of a designated campsite, but it wasn't private land either. It was just wilderness. Dense forests, a calm lake, and endless quiet. It was exactly what I wanted. The drive took about 9 hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking low in the sky. I parked my car on the edge of a narrow dirt trail and loaded up my gear. My backpack was heavy with supplies: a tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight, and a small knife. I also had a fire starter and a compact cooking stove. I double-checked everything, locked the car, and began walking down the trail. The trail twisted and turned through thick pine trees, their sharp scent filling the air. After about 45 minutes of walking, I found a small clearing near the lake. It was perfect. The ground was level, and the view of the water was stunning. The surface of the lake shimmered in the fading light, and the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood from the forest floor, and got a small fire going. By the time I cooked and ate a quick meal, the sky was completely dark. I sat by the fire for a while, enjoying the crackling flames and the cool night air. The isolation felt good. There was no phone service out here, no emails, no noise, just me and nature. As the fire died down, I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut. The darkness was absolute, and the only sounds were the occasional calls of distant animals. It took me a while to fall asleep, but eventually, I drifted off. I woke up suddenly, unsure of what had startled me. My heart was racing, and I lay completely still, straining to hear. The forest was silent, save for the faint rustle of leaves. Could have been an animal passing by, I told myself. Nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam of light illuminated the inside of the tent, but everything looked normal. My gear was exactly where I'd left it. After a few minutes of listening to the quiet, I convinced myself I was overreacting and went back to sleep. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning exploring the area around the lake, taking photos, and fishing off a small rocky outcrop. The tranquility of the place started to calm my nerves. By the time evening rolled around, I'd almost forgotten about the strange feeling I'd had the night before. That night, I made a bigger fire and cooked a more elaborate meal. As I sat by the flames, watching the stars appear one by one, I felt a deep sense of peace. This was why I'd come out here, to escape the chaos of life and reconnect with something simpler. The peace didn't last. It was sometime after midnight when I woke again, this time to a distinct noise. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It was the sound of footsteps. My tent was zipped shut, and I was lying on my back, frozen. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves outside. They circled my tent once, then stopped. I felt my breath catch in my throat. Someone was out there. The logical part of my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hunter or another camper who had wandered too far. Maybe they'd seen my fire earlier and were curious. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. I was miles from any trailhead, and I hadn't seen a single person since I'd arrived. I reached for my knife, clutching it tightly in my hand. The footsteps started again, moving away from the tent this time. I waited, listening as they faded into the distance. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I found myself on edge. I checked the area around my tent for any signs of whoever or whatever had been there, but there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing at the edge of the trees, staring back at me. By afternoon, I decided I'd had enough. I didn't want to spend another night here. I packed up my gear and started the hike back to my car. The walk felt longer than it had before. The forest seemed darker, the trees pressing in closer. Every sound made me jump. A snapping twig, a bird taking flight, the distant rustle of leaves. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was never anyone there. When I finally reached the spot where I'd left my car, my relief was short-lived. The car was gone. First, I thought I was in the wrong place. I double-checked the landmarks, a fallen tree, a patch of wildflowers, but there was no doubt. This was where I'd parked. Panic set in. My phone had no service, and the nearest town was at least 20 miles away. It was already late afternoon, and I knew I couldn't make it there before dark. I had no choice but to go back to the clearing by the lake. At least there I had shelter and supplies. The walk back was even worse than before. The forest felt alive, as if it were watching me. Shadows stretched longer, and every rustle of leaves made my skin crawl. When I reached the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My tent was gone. The fire pit I'd built was still there, the ashes cold and undisturbed. But there was no sign of my tent or any of my gear. It was as if I'd never been there at all. I stood in the middle of the clearing, trying to make sense of it. Had I somehow taken a wrong turn? But no, the lake was right there, the same lake I'd fished in yesterday. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from the trees. My blood turned to ice. I didn't wait to see who or what had made the sound. I ran. I didn't stop running until my legs gave out. By then, the sun had set, and the forest was plunged into darkness. I collapsed against a tree, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to keep moving, but I had no idea where I was or where I was going. For hours, I stumbled through the forest, tripping over roots and crashing through underbrush. The darkness was suffocating, and every sound made me jump. Eventually, I saw a faint light in the distance. It flickered like a campfire, and I felt a surge of hope. Maybe it was another camper, someone who could help me. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The fire was in the middle of a small clearing, but there was no one around. No tent, no gear, nothing. And then I saw it. In the dirt around the fire, someone had written a single word: leave. I didn't wait to find out who had written it. I turned and ran, the darkness swallowing me whole. By the time the sun rose, I was completely lost. My clothes were torn, my body covered in scratches, and my throat dry from lack of water. But I kept moving, driven by pure fear. Eventually, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I followed it for what felt like hours before I finally saw a car. I flagged it down, and the driver, a middle-aged man in a pickup truck, gave me a ride to the nearest town. I never went back for my car or my gear. I filed a police report, but nothing ever came of it. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that laugh. And I know I'll never camp alone again.